Our panel this morning is going to be about short and long-term risks of high-THC products. We invited in Representative Lauren Davis kindly agreed to introduce people as they come in to speak. So thanks so much, and to Rep. Davis.
Thank you. I'm introducing all of them.
I think you can do one by one, just to bring up between the presentations. Are you confident?
I am. I just need to relocate. No, that's fine. So do you want me to just do Tracy first?
Yeah, the Tracy and the first speaker, is that okay?
Are they going in the order that they're listed?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Wonderful. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. If the goal was to make us deeply uncomfortable, that has been achieved, at least for an audience of one. And I'm a person who spends a lot of my waking hours thinking about drugs, and that is still the case. So it's my pleasure to introduce first our moderator, Dr. Tracy Klein, who is an associate professor at the Washington State University College of and Evaluation Services, which is a shared office with the Multnomah County Health Department and the Oregon Health Authority Public Health Division. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Klein and Dr. Dilley. We're going to have, I think, I'm not sure if we're doing two up there at once, maybe. I don't know. I don't want to make everybody else stand, but I think I'll pop up and do intros in between, it sounds like.
Thank you. Dr. Dilley is over here, and she'll be coming up and doing her presentation in just a moment.
Thank you. I have the back to conferencing in person awkwardness thing, so please forgive me. I'm here to talk today a little bit about high THC products from a public health lens, and especially from the perspective of the data that we can access readily within public health systems. I always want to give acknowledgments. I have so many fantastic colleagues in Oregon and Washington and the RAND Corporation and poison centers in Colorado, so always thank you to my great colleagues. So there are two main research questions from a public health lens for me. The first, which I'll focus on today, is how does a legal cannabis market affect consumption of high THC products in populations and health and safety outcomes? And then the next question, which Dr. Calkins already gave us some foundational information about, is so what do we do about it from a can we protect public health and mitigate harms? Again, I'm going to focus on the first question primarily, and there's others. Dr. Rosalie Pacula and Jillian Schauer are going to be talking more about detailed regulatory things as well. So today I'm going to share with you some data, again, from our public health surveillance systems, or data that we can access for public health surveillance purposes, specifically the systems we have that contain information about THC concentrations. So we have many data systems that don't include any information about specific products, cannabis products, so I'm focusing on the ones where we do have that information. Also, a little note, I'm going to focus mainly on pre-pandemic data periods just to uncomplicate our lives a little bit. So first, let's focus on market data. So data from cannabis regulatory agencies. The photo here is from Oregon from last fall. I just include it because I think it makes the point that the very presence of cannabis markets in communities can have an effect in addition to the sales that they do, but I'm going to mainly focus on sales and licensing data. So here's some information from the Washington Liquor and Cannabis Board. On the left is the number of active cannabis licensees, retail licensees in Washington State over the period since legalization began. So markets opened for the first time in July of 2014, and then the numbers on the graph are the number that were operating, actively making sales within the state in December of each calendar year after that. So you can see that it took a few years for the market to get up and running, and then for the last 3 years or so of our trend here, we have 400 or thereabouts retailers that are operating within the state, and that's been holding fairly steady. And then for context, on the right, I'm showing per capita cannabis retail licensees in the first 4 legalized states as of December 2019. So one thing you'll notice is that Washington has fewer per capita cannabis retail licensees operating. So as we talk about what we're seeing in Washington and the impact of cannabis legalization in markets on behaviors and outcomes, just keep in your mind that Washington does look a little different from other states. So I just want to put that into your heads that things could look a little different in other places. I won't spend time on this because Dr. Calkins already talked about the change in the composition of the market and sales as time has gone along in retail. So this was a study that Dr. Calkins was part of, and it looks a lot like the results he shared already, which is that sales go up over time as retail markets operate and change, and the proportion of markets the proportion of sales that are for higher THC products like concentrates and edibles increases as a share of the market over time. So this is Washington-specific data, but the story is the same as what Dr. Calkins already shared. So that's a market perspective. So now what about behaviors? How does that market and the availability of products affect behaviors for people? So I have 2 data sources. The first is the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System from Washington State. BRFIS is an ongoing telephone survey of adults. It's the main way that state public health systems monitor all kinds of health behaviors among adults. The second is school-based health behavior surveys. In Washington State, that's the Healthy Youth Survey, which is given to 8th, 10th, and 12th graders every other year. It's I'm biased, but I'll say I think it's the leading, certainly one of the leading school-based health surveys in the United States, and has response rates high and numbers within the hundreds of thousands of kids. So we have lots of powerful information about all kinds of things, including cannabis use among kids. So this chart is showing you the prevalence or the percentage of adults who said they used cannabis in the past 30 days in Washington State from 2012, which was the year when Initiative 502 or cannabis legalization passed on the ballot, from 2012 through 2019. And I have some important policy notes kind of listed here. So when the retail sales began, so that was 2014, 2 years after the ballot initiative passed. And then later, LCB announced the increases in numbers of retail licensees. So there's some important changes in what legalization looks like over time. But the most important thing for our discussion today is...
I'm so sorry, can you get a little closer to the mic because people are having trouble hearing me?
Okay, thanks. I'm to be closer. The most important thing to take away is that the percentage of adults who are who say that they have used cannabis in the past 30 days is increasing over time. So from 2012 to 2019, we went from 8% to 17% of adults who said they'd used cannabis in the past 30 days. But that's any cannabis product, and as we just talked about, there's all kinds of cannabis products. So let's look, one thing that we have added then to the BRFIS survey is beginning in 2015, for those adults who said they used cannabis in the past 30 days, we said, okay, well, how did you use it? Did you smoke it? Did you take an edible? Did you vaporize it? Did you dab it? Did you drink it in an infused beverage? So this chart is the percentage of adult cannabis users and who said that they used cannabis in any of these particular ways. They can have multiple, so they could smoke and take edibles. What I want you to see from this is that smoking has and remains the highest percentage of product use among adult cannabis users, but it's been declining over time. So in 2015, 85% of adults who used cannabis said that they smoked it at least once when they were using, down to 70% in 2019. And at the same time, you're seeing this increase in the percentage of adults who say they use these higher THC concentration products like edibles and vapes. So for example, vapes went up from 17% in 2015 up to 27% in 2019. On the Healthy Youth Survey, Washington State's school-based youth survey, the overall story about how cannabis use looks among youth over time is a little bit complicated, but I would say for today, just assume it's kind of a flat line. It hasn't dramatically changed. But we did add, beginning in 2014, a similar question onto the youth survey. So for kids who said that they used cannabis in the past 30 days, we said, how did you usually use it? So they could only give us one answer. But the pattern here is similar to what you just saw for adults. So from 2014 to 16 to 18, we see this drop in the percentage of kids who said they're usually smoking it, and then modest increases in kids who say that they are usually using it by edibles, vapes, drinks, and then in 2018 we added dabs as an answer option, and a fairly high percentage of kids are saying they use dabs. But this usual way question is not as sensitive as just saying, did you use it in any of these ways? So the good news is that Washington changed that for 2021's youth survey, and then I want to show you up here the most recent Washington data, which are the gray bars, compared to Oregon's data. Oregon had been asking the question this way for the past several years, so you can kind of see a change over time in Oregon using that more sensitive question, and then you can see Washington's most current data. So on the left side, this is the percentage of kids who used cannabis in the past 30 days who said that they smoked it. Whether or not they used it in another way. And in Oregon, Oregon's 11th graders, that went from 93% of those kids in 2017 down to 80% of kids in 2019. And in Washington, in 2021, among 10th graders who had used cannabis, 67% said that they had smoked cannabis. And then on the flip side, with these higher THC products, you can see Oregon, kids who used cannabis who said they vaporized it went from 11% up to 44%. And in Washington State, 10th graders, of kids who said they had used cannabis in the past 30 days, 51% had used by vaporizing. So that's changes in adults and youth types of products that they've used for cannabis. So then you may be thinking to yourself, okay, so what's the relationship between these cannabis markets and behaviors? This is too many words. I'll say the bottom line is we've linked time-varying local area data for both adults and youth to look at patterns of cannabis use and how those have changed as local area cannabis retailers open up. So, and so far I will say one caveat is we've only been looking at this for cannabis products overall, not by specific product type, but that's certainly our next research agenda item. For adults, we've published data showing that, again, linking at the local level, among adults, if they're living in communities where a cannabis retailer opens less than 0.8 miles from their zip code area, the current use of cannabis increased, and specifically frequent use increased, so using 20 or more days in the past month increased significantly. But for adults that live far away, more than 18 miles away from where a cannabis retailer opens up, they don't seem to have any change in their cannabis use pattern. So it's those neighborhood area opening cannabis retailers that may be having an effect. And we saw something similar with youth. The model looks a little bit differently, but the findings are the same. So when cannabis retailers begin operation in areas where kids are in school, we see increases for 10th graders in current and frequent use of cannabis. We see also changes in their perceived access. They perceive cannabis as more easy to get, and they also change or become less prevention motivated in terms of believing that cannabis use is wrong for them, or thinking that their friends believe it wrong, and thinking that their parents think it's wrong, and thinking that adults in their community think it's wrong. So all these kind of attitudes and beliefs among kids are changing. We did see, so that was 10th graders. For 8th graders, we didn't see changes in use, but we did see also some changes in a couple of these belief indicators, which are upstream indicators of whether kids might begin to use cannabis later in life. So these are important associations. The presence of the markets can have an effect on adult and youth behaviors. So what do we know about adverse health events then? So we're fortunate to have data available from U.S. poison control centers. This is a unique data source that contains information about cannabis product types. So for those who look at hospitalization or ED data, ICD-10 codes just say cannabis. They don't say edibles or vapes or anything like that. So poison center data are unique in that they tell us about the product that was involved in the exposure. The calls come in from both individuals, so people in homes who have an exposure, they're experiencing symptoms, they need help, they call the poison center to get help from a toxicologist or a nurse consultant. Also healthcare facilities where healthcare providers are providing care and they don't know what to do about a specific exposure. So we get calls from both of these folks. So poison center calls are really a signal indicator of events. They're not a comprehensive, like this is definitely just a canary in the coal mine indicator for all the health events that are going on out there. And another point is that as people have become more accustomed to Googling when they're scared in their home and they need help, now they're Googling or going on Facebook or whatever, they may be looking for information in different ways than they used to in the past. So when we hear a signal coming through poison centers, I'm taking that very seriously because those signals are quieter than they used to be when people were more likely to call poison control centers. So I have 3 stories about what we've seen specific to THC products, THC relevant products in poison center data. So the first is we looked at data from reported to U.S. poison centers for all states. We looked by product type, at how, what kinds of product exposures were being reported to poison centers over time. So I'm splitting it into plant-based products, so that's like flower and bud, and then manufactured products, meaning edibles, vapes, and concentrates, those higher THC products. That dashed line that you see at the top is the same as the dashed line from the prior slide, showing that total cannabis exposures have gone up over time. This is from 2017 to 2019. But plant material specific exposures reported have gone down. You can see that, that's the solid black line. And then what's driving that upward trend are these manufactured products, with edibles making up the greatest proportion of those. And in our models, we looked at whether legalization was associated with that, and sure enough, states that have legalized are showing greater increases in these manufactured product exposures compared to states that have not legalized. So here's a second story, trick or treat. And actually, Dr. Jillian Schauer, who'll be talking later today, called last year, and in collaboration with colleagues in New York, we were just kind of pondering that you see these media stories coming up around Halloween. They'll be coming out soon now, that people start to speculate about kids accidentally getting into cannabis-infused edibles during Halloween and maybe getting those confused with their Halloween candy. So we wanted to look and see, okay, can we find anything about that in our poison center data? So we looked at seasonal patterns of reported edible exposures by age group in all states combined, and then looking at by legalized states as well. And what we did find was that edible exposures increase about 25% among children under 10, 22% among youth ages 11 to 20, but it's during that November, December versus other months. So that, Halloween is at the beginning of that period, but that increase in risk really continues throughout the holiday season. A third story, and this is a story unique to Washington that I'm proud to be able to share. So in 2017, Washington Liquor and Cannabis Board was getting concerned about child exposures for edibles in the state's medical market, or state's retail market. So they changed the rules about how cannabis edibles needed to be packaged. On the right, you'll see a picture of some cannabis edibles from Washington State. Two things to notice. One is that there's a not for kids label with the red hand, so a kind of like a Mr. Yuck type sticker, supposed to be a flag for this is not for kids. It includes the Poison Center telephone number on it, so making that available to people. But the second thing that I'm especially interested in is you can see through the clear side of that package that each gummy within this package is individually wrapped inside the package. So if this were to be out on a table and a toddler got into it, they might get into the outside bag, but then they have to get into the second packaging within the inside bag. Thank you. So we looked at differences. So within Washington, cannabis edibles poisonings reported to the Poison Center before and after the policy, and then compared to other states before and after the policy. We limited to those exposures that had significant health outcomes because we wanted to screen out people who just called more often because the Poison Center phone number was on the package. And we actually thought maybe we would see increases in Poison Center calls in Washington just because of having that phone number on the package. So that's why we wanted to isolate those serious exposures that we thought probably would have been called in any case. So what we found was that this policy implementation, the change in packaging, was associated with a 25% reduction in edible poisoning reports for children under 10, 51% reduction for ages 10 to 20, and a 23% reduction for adults 55 and older. So not only a benefit for kids and reducing some of the, these like pretty significant health exposures for children, but also for older adults. So maybe that packaging also communicates to adults and helps adults to, titrate their own dose more effectively than they would have otherwise. Okay, so what? So we know that there's more sales of higher concentration products, more people are using them. Maybe there's some regulatory stuff we can do, so what do we do with that? And I think that's part of the conversation today. I will say we were instructed to offer some ideas. So here's some ideas from my perspective based on what we have seen. I think that regulatory approaches relevant to THC content in the market might include product regulations, like what can be sold, the potency of those products that can be sold, purchasing limits, maybe times of day, different places, price incentives, and Dr. Calkins talked about taxing as a good thing, and then promotion. So the billboard on the right side of the screen is from Washington State from 2017. I think this is a good example of where, like Dr. Carlini said, we as Washington were one of the first states to legalize, and sometimes we did stuff and we said, oh, we don't like that, so let's change it up. There were fewer limits on advertising early on in the legal market, and this, my understanding was the billboard that sort of tipped tip the conversation over to say, we're not very happy in Washington about some of the content of the advertising that's out there and can be seen by kids. So the legislature took action. So I'm proud to say that those kinds of billboards don't appear now in Washington state. So I think that's a good example of where regulation maybe didn't directly address THC concentration, but I think that it's relevant because here this very cute billboard is kind of promoting that THC concentration and the approach of getting high. Some other policy ideas are healthcare and behavioral health systems may need support for their screening processes and intervention processes for people that they're helping to take care of. And then last, I would say, especially because we're seeing these changes in youth consumption patterns, maybe we need youth-centered social marketing campaigns and safe storage campaigns, maybe with a seasonal emphasis. And the policy element in there is the dedication of resources and the mandate to do those things. So those are health education campaigns, but we may need policies to make sure that those get out there and that that we can do them. And that is it. Thank you.
And before we have our next speaker, I just wanted to let the audience know that we will be doing all of our questions at the end of the presentation. We'll have an opportunity for the panel to respond. So do utilize the poll EV feature, and we will track those questions. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for the fabulous presentation. Our next speaker is Dr. Carrie Cuttler, who is an assistant professor at Washington State University and directs the Health and Cognition Lab. Looking forward to hearing from her. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here today to talk about the chronic and acute effects of high-potency flower and concentrates on cognition. So if you've ever been into one of the hundreds, as we saw, cannabis dispensaries serving our state, you would see that they carry an enormous variety of high-potency cannabis products, including cannabis flower that typically exceeds 20% THC, edibles sold in 10 milligram doses in our state, tinctures that you can place under your tongue, lotions you can apply to your skin, suppositories that I won't further describe, and cannabis concentrates that I will further describe on the next slide. Now, importantly, research has focused almost exclusively on the effects of cannabis flower and edibles. There has been an absolute dearth of research examining the effects of all of these other products, including cannabis concentrates. Now, as their name implies, cannabis concentrates are a highly concentrated form of the drug that are typically produced using chemical solvents like butane. And the end product is an oil, wax, or resin-like substance that's heated and the vapor is inhaled. Now, they typically have over 60% THC, but can also exceed 90% THC. Over half of cannabis users say they have used concentrates, and 13 to 37% report using them on a regular basis. These concentrates are becoming increasingly more popular, with one study finding that concentrate shares in Washington state increased by almost 150%, while flower shares in our state showed a slight decrease between 2014 and 2016. And all of this has people very concerned because we know that higher doses of cannabis increase the detrimental outcomes of cannabis use, so we assume that higher potency versions of the drug will also increase these detrimental outcomes. I mean, this is why we're here today, isn't it? We're concerned. Now, while any adult age 21 or older can walk into any of these over 400 cannabis dispensaries in our state and purchase a wide variety of high-potency products, including concentrates, the federal classification of cannabis as a Schedule I drug imposes numerous legal restrictions and hurdles that have impeded research on the acute effects. Specifically, researchers working in federally funded institutions must spend years applying to various agencies before they can administer cannabis to research participants in their labs. And getting a DEA license alone can take upwards of 18 months. Before that, you need approvals from the FDA, IRB, Department of Health, and so on. Further, until very recently, researchers in the US have been required to only use cannabis sourced from the NIDA drug supply. And the problem as shown on this slide is the cannabis NIDA produces is not at all representative of the high quality, high potency products that consumers are accessing and using. Until recently, the highest potency cannabis they've produced is under 10% in THC, while once again consumers are accessing products that can exceed 90%. NIDA does not produce cannabis concentrates for human consumption at this time. That black tar-looking goo on the slide is for the exclusive use of animal research, which is probably for the best, because concentrated oil should really look more like that honey-colored liquid shown on the slide. Now, because of these restrictions, there's been almost no research on the effects of cannabis concentrates on humans. Now, of course, there has been a great deal of research on the influence of chronic and acute exposure to lower potency cannabis on cognition, and this was nicely summarized in a recent 2021 meta-review of meta-analyses. And it showed small to moderate-sized chronic and acute effects of cannabis on memory, especially tests of verbal free recall and working memory, as well as executive functioning. There was some limited evidence that CBD might protect against some of the memory-impairing effects of THC, with 2 previous studies providing some evidence to that effect. But many aspects of memory have been under-investigated or not investigated at all. For instance, the acute and chronic effects of cannabis on temporal order memory, our ability to remember the order past events occurred, source memory, our ability to remember the source of previously learned information, and prospective memory, our ability to remember to execute tasks in the future, have been under-investigated, as most people have just relied very heavily on verbal memory and working memory tests. And again, as I indicated previously, there's been a heavy reliance on low-potency cannabis, which may be diminishing some of these documented effects. So again, due to these federal restrictions, there's been almost no research examining whether concentrates are more detrimental to cognition than traditional flower. However, a couple of self-report studies found that concentrate users perceive greater risk of developing problems with memory, concentration, and motivation from concentrate use versus flower. And another study found that they report poorer memory and attention when using concentrates compared to flower. Now, only one study has objectively examined the acute effects of cannabis concentrates on cognition. They included 3 measures of memory, verbal memory, working memory, and episodic memory tests. They found no significant effects of either high-potency flower or concentrates on any of these outcomes. I'll just quickly mention they bypassed federal restrictions on acute cannabis research by having participants use cannabis in their own home and then coming out to a van parked outside their home for testing. So me and 2 of my graduate students, Emily LaFrance and Aria Petrucci, set out to examine which aspects of cognition are detrimentally affected by the chronic use of these high-potency cannabis products. And in doing so, we also wanted to determine whether concentrate users would demonstrate objectively worse cognitive test performance than exclusive flower users. These are our inclusion and exclusion criteria. Cannabis users had to report use on a daily or near daily basis for at least a year and have a positive THC urine test, while non-users had to report use fewer than 10 times in their life, no use in the past year, and have a negative urine test. They had to be very healthy. They couldn't be heavy drinkers or smokers. Cannabis users had to abstain from using cannabis on the day of the testing session so that we would be assessing the chronic rather than acute effects in this study. And experimenters were blind to participants' cannabis use status. We recruited 98 non-users and 100 cannabis users that met these criteria. 46 of the cannabis users reported exclusively using flower, while 54 reported using both flower and concentrates regularly. The sample was well balanced with respect to gender, but was predominantly white and young, average age around 24. Now, the groups are found to differ with respect to level of education, with both groups of cannabis users reporting lower levels of education than non-users, but there were no other significant group differences, and I statistically control for these differences in education in the upcoming results. And these participants completed a 1.5-hour battery of cognitive tests in the controlled laboratory environment while sober. Now, the test battery included a couple of tests of prospective memory. Again, this refers to our ability to remember to execute tasks at a later time. And to measure this, we asked participants to try to remember to rate how difficult they found each test immediately after completing each. And they were told they wouldn't be reminded to do this. It'd be up to them to do this on their own. We also asked participants to try to remember to request for their $50 compensation towards the end of the study. And what you can see here are medium-sized effects of cannabis use, with both groups of cannabis users performing worse than non-users. And the difference between flower users and concentrate users is not significant. We use the California Verbal Learning Test to assess verbal memory. Here, participants listen to a list of 16 words, and they have to immediately recall that list. They do this 3 times, and then about 20 minutes later, they're asked to recall the list again for the delayed recall trial. And again, we see medium-sized effects of groups, such that both groups of cannabis users are performing worse than non-users on both the immediate and delayed recall trials of this test, and the difference between the concentrate and flower users is not significant. We also assessed simple episodic recall by asking participants to briefly describe each of the tests that they had to complete at the end of the study. The results revealed a small size effect, with concentrate users performing significantly worse than non-users. The flower users' performance didn't differ significantly from either of the other 2 groups. And then finally, we found a small size significant effective group on the incidental recall trial of the digit symbol substitution test. In this test, participants are given a legend with various symbols that are corresponding to different digits. Below that are a bunch of digits. They have to fill in all the symbols as quickly and as accurately as possible. Well, at the end, we take away the legend and we ask them to do this from memory. They're not expecting that to happen. And what you can see here is that flower users this time perform significantly worse than non-users, and now the concentrate users are not significantly different from either of the other 2 groups. Those are all the significant effects out of a 1.5-hour battery of cognitive tests. We found no significant effects of regular use of high-potency flower or concentrates on measures of visual spatial memory, temporal order memory, source memory, working memory, or 3 different measures of executive functioning. And to my knowledge, this is the first study to attempt to examine the chronic effects of cannabis on either temporal order memory or source memory. Whoops, sorry about that. Jumped right ahead. Now, most critically, we found no significant differences in the performance of the groups who reported the exclusive use of flower relative to the group who reported using both flower and concentrates, thereby providing no real evidence for the notion that regular use of concentrates is associated with worse cognitive outcomes than exclusive use of flower. Now, for the next study I'll describe, me and 2 of my students, Emily LaFrance and Amanda Stuber, set out to examine the acute effects of high-potency cannabis, which we defined as having at least 20% THC, on prospective, source, false, and temporal order memory, as well as non-normative decision-making. And in doing so, we wanted to compare, again, the effects of these cannabis concentrates to cannabis flower, and we also wanted to compare the acute effects of cannabis flower with CBD to flower without CBD to see if it actually might be protective. And we were able to bypass all of the legal restrictions on acute cannabis research by having participants purchase and administer their own cannabis in their own environment off federal property while we simply observed them over Zoom video chat. So we conducted an observational field experiment. Participants were randomly assigned to purchase and use one of 3 different product types or remain sober. Participants had to abstain from using cannabis on the day of the testing session, but the average period of abstinence was closer to 24 hours. We did some baseline measures, then we observed them using their product or abstaining from use over Zoom, and then we administered a series of cognitive tests over Zoom. We compensated participants for their time, but not their cannabis purchase, using Amazon gift cards, because at least as of today, you can't buy cannabis on Amazon, I'm sure in the near future though. So I was able to bypass all the legal restrictions surrounding acute cannabis research because participants were legally purchasing and using their own cannabis in their own environment off federal property. I didn't purchase the drug, I didn't administer it, I didn't even touch the drug. We just observed a legal act. These were all the exclusion and inclusion criteria. I'm not going to go through them all. Basically, they had to be very healthy. Couldn't use other drugs, couldn't be heavy drinkers or smokers, couldn't be breastfeeding or pregnant. Now, to minimize the risk of anyone having an adverse event over Zoom when we couldn't help them, they also had to report that they had never previously experienced any adverse events with cannabis. They had to report experience using both concentrates and flower. They had to be of legal age to purchase cannabis in our state and live in our state. We recruited 80 participants who met these strict criteria and randomly assigned them to one of 4 groups. So 20 were randomly assigned to serve as a sober control group. 20 were randomly assigned to a THC flower condition where they purchased and used a joint containing at least 20% THC and no CBD. 20 were randomly assigned to a THC plus CBD flower condition where they smoked a joint containing at least 20% THC and some CBD, at least 0.7%. Now, we initially aimed for way higher levels of CBD than this, but it proved exceptionally difficult to find in such high potency flower. Finally, 20 were randomly assigned to use a concentrated oil to get a vape pen that contained at least 60% THC and again, at least 0.7% CBD. And importantly, random assignment did work to produce groups that were equivalent in all important respects, including demographic characteristics, cannabis use patterns, and pre-morbid verbal IQ. We recorded the number of puffs participants took, and we timed the durations of their inhalations and holds, and we found that participants randomly assigned to use an extremely high potency concentrate took significantly fewer puffs than those smoking flower joints. They also had longer inhalations. Now, by taking fewer puffs of these higher potency products, they achieved the exact same subjective high as those inhaling high potency flower. So all 4 groups reported no intoxication at baseline. The sober group remains flat at the bottom there. The 3 cannabis-using groups reported an average intoxication rating around 6 right after use, and that rating was sustained throughout the period of the study, with no significant differences in the intoxication ratings of any of the 3 cannabis-using groups at any time. For the first test, participants saw a series of pictures and written words. We just used screen sharing. And they subsequently had to freely recall as many as possible. You can see there was a medium-sized effect with the participants who smoked the joint containing both THC and CBD, recalling significantly fewer pictures than the control group, the sober control group. Now, to look at actual source memory, participants then completed a recognition test where we read them a list of words and asked which were previously presented as pictures and which were previously presented as words. The results revealed a large size effective group such that the THC flower and concentrate groups had worse source memory for pictures. We use the Diess-Roediger-McDermott paradigm to assess susceptibility to false memories. So here, participants listen to lists of words that are all related to a critical lure that's never presented. For example, they might hear the words tired, pillow, bed, dream. These are all related to the critical lure sleep, but that's never presented. They do a free recall and recognition test that includes these critical lures, other words related to the words list, like soft, and then words completely unrelated to the word list, something like truck. We found a medium-sized affected group on free recall with participants who smoked a joint containing both THC and CBD, once again having worse free recall. The concentrate group had more false memories for related words, and all three cannabis-using groups had more false memories for completely unrelated words relative to the sober control group. We also administered 2 tests of prospective memory, a couple measures of temporal order memory, and 4 measures of non-normative decision-making, but we found no significant effects of any of these 3 products on performance of these tests. This is the first study to examine the acute effects of cannabis on each of these aspects of cognition. We also found no significant differences between the performance of those who were randomly assigned to use cannabis flower relative to those who were assigned to use a concentrate. So to summarize, consistent with previous research, we most reliably detected chronic and acute effects of cannabis on memory, especially verbal free recall. But we also detected chronic effects of the drug on prospective memory, incidental memory, and episodic memory. And we detected acute effects of the drug on source memory and false memory. We did not find much evidence that cannabis detrimentally impairs temporal order memory or non-normative decision-making. But it's important to note we might have been underpowered to detect some of these effects. Also, our failure to detect effects on these domains of cognition may pertain to our use of highly experienced cannabis users. So again, these were cannabis users who were using on a daily or near daily basis. And it's apparent that some people will habituate to some of the effects of cannabis over time. Now, the fact that the participants in the Acute study were inhaling their products and performing these tests in their own familiar, comfortable home environment, instead of the more foreign and potentially anxiety-provoking lab environment, may have also contributed to some of the null results. We did not find that CBD offset the detrimental effects of THC. In fact, the group that smoked the joint containing both THC and CBD had more memory impairments than the group that smoked just the THC flower joint. I mentioned 2 studies that revealed evidence that CBD might offset some of the detrimental effects of THC on memory. One of the authors of one of those studies couldn't replicate their own finding, and there's increasing evidence that CBD might actually potentiate plasma levels of THC. But to me, one of the most important and encouraging findings from these studies is the lack of evidence that cannabis concentrates are more detrimental to cognition than flower. This was not my hypothesis. Again, due to their extreme high potency, there's been a lot of speculation that concentrates would magnify the harms of cannabis. My studies instead indicate that neither the chronic use of concentrates nor acute intoxication on concentrates is worse for cognition than flower. Instead, we see that participants self-titrate their use of extremely high-potency concentrates to achieve comparable levels of intoxication and impairment as those using flower. Thank you again for your time today. Thank you, Bia, and the organizers, my graduate students here. And again, I run the THC lab, the Health and Cognition lab at WSU. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cuttler. Next up, we have the amazing Dr. Jason Kilmer, who I actually used to work with when I was a UW employee back in the day, who is the Associate Professor in Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences here at the University of Washington, and frankly, just a national expert in collegiate substance use, among other things. So please welcome Dr. Kilmer. There's a lot more info about folks' bios for all of our speakers. I just don't want to read them all this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You know, Lauren, I didn't know you were going to say that, and I wanted to start my 20 minutes, by just acknowledging Lauren's done so much around suicide prevention, around mental health issues with the Washington Recovery Alliance. The fact that we're doing this on a college campus and you've been such a champion for college student health, mental health, thank you from the bottom of my heart with that. You've been so amazing. I was asked to talk about cannabis use by young adults, look at trends, and look at considerations moving forward. I do want to thank Dr. Bia Carlini and Lexi Nims for the invitation to present today. And I'm lucky, I work at the Center for the Study of Health and Risk Behaviors, and essentially on a daily basis, I get the chance to just learn from such amazing people who do not only incredible research, but really have an eye toward what does this mean in the real world. And I just want to acknowledge and thank all of them. When people ask, so why do research with young adults between the ages of 18 and 25? SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, their national survey on drug use and health, this is what you see with past year cannabis use by age group. 12 to 17-year-olds, 10% with any past year use. 18 to 25-year-olds, the age group I tend to work with, 34.5%. 26 and older, 16.3%. To me, there's three important things to draw from this slide. First, I want to thank SAMHSA for putting me in the same age group as 26-year-olds. So, and that's my time, thank you. Second, the age group we tend to work with is the group that uses most frequently, yet most people aren't using. And we have decades of research that show that when people think, quote, everyone uses, they're more likely to potentially start themselves. They're more likely to keep whatever use is out there continuing. So we want to be aware of those norms. So in Washington, we have our Young Adult Health Survey funded by the Division of Behavioral Health and Recovery within the Healthcare Authority. Big thank you to Sarah Mariani, who's in the audience today, Sandy Salavares, who we get to work with on this project. And our team, along with myself, Mary Larimer, Isaac Rue, shout out to Allison Rose, who joined our team just last month. But our goal was collect as much data before the first retail store opened in July 2014. And for the most part, we were able to do that. We pounced quickly. Almost 70% of the data were collected before the first store opened. The remaining 31% were collected into August of 2014. Only 18 stores had opened statewide in July. Only 31 had opened by August. And since this was a statewide survey, our hope was it still counted as a good pre-time point. Participants were recruited on purpose using multiple strategies. You know, a random sample from the Department of Licensing, that only gives you people with stable housing, people who've kept up to date on their address changes, those with licenses. So we did a direct mail from a random sample from the Department of Licensing, as well as online advertising, largely through social media. What that let us do is monitor demographics as participants were coming in, so we could turn up the dial on certain regions of the state, for example, if people were being underrepresented. It is a convenient sample, not a random sample, but again, that was very much by design. To improve generalizability, use post-stratification weights based on gender identity, race, and geographic region. And the good news is the weighted results are consistently very similar to the non-weighted results. Each year, we collect data from a new cohort of 18 to 25-year-olds. And with 8 cohorts completely collected data from, we have over 16,000 young adults that we've been able to get in snapshots in time. But what's been cool for us is each year we follow up with previous cohorts. We're in our 9th year of data collection right now. The cohort we recruited in 2014 as 18 to 25-year-olds in 2014 is now 26 to 33, or people in my age group, according to SIPSA. Dr. Katerina Gutmanova, who has been such a champion, not only for can we look at unintended impacts, are there people for whom there are differential impacts, and who recognize this data set is really rich, applied for and obtained a secondary data analysis grant that's allowed us to look at things that were outside the scope of the original contract. We got the good news today. She received a secondary data analysis grant. I work with such a star, and Katarina's does such incredible work with people. This led to a number of publications that we've been able to use our Young Adult Health Survey data for. I just want to draw your attention to one that I was most directly involved with. We had in this spring a study published that looked at cannabis use after implementation of legalization in Washington. We had just shy of 13,000 young adults over 6 time points, co-varied everything we could to try and account for differences that could come from sex assigned at birth, race, ethnicity, where they were in Washington, age, 4-year college status or not, full-time employment status, and again, the findings were weighted to control for distribution across the samples. The bottom line is that we see a statistically significant increase in this age group in any past year use, at least monthly use, at least weekly use, and at least daily, moving down the slide in frequency. When you do a deeper dive and look at that more closely, it's clear that 21 to 25-year-olds are driving some of those findings. Any past year cannabis use, it is that older group within 18 to 25-year-olds driving that. At least monthly, that's the case too. I present to students all the time. As recently as Wednesday, I was asked, wait, but it's not physically addictive, right? It's only psychologically addictive. I think we have a lot of work to do to make sure people understand how cannabis use disorder can look. And so it's not new that we can diagnose for people being addicted. In the old days, 2012. We had the DSM-4, and we talked about cannabis dependence and cannabis abuse. When the DSM-5 came out in 2013, we talked about substance use disorders, and specifically cannabis use disorder. What we found in across our cohorts was that endorsing at least past year cannabis use disorder symptoms has gone up significantly. So it's not just that more people are trying it here and there. It's that we're seeing an increase in frequency of use and people reporting more symptoms associated with cannabis use disorder. What have trends looked like in the 2 years that followed? Well, I'm going to go through this quickly because you're going to see a very consistent theme evolve. Cohort 1, when we look at past year non-medical use, you see the final 5 cohorts are all significantly higher than cohort 1. There's also a significant linear trend, but when you do a deeper dive in the model split over and under 21 years of age, it's the 21 to 25-year-olds driving that. And just to show this graphically, that's what that looks like. That slide took me an hour to make, so I'm just going to leave it up for 5 more seconds. Thank you. At least monthly, final 4 cohorts significantly higher than cohort 1, consistent trend. Here's an increasing linear trend, and the deeper dive shows it's coming from the 21 to 25-year-olds. And here this is graphically. You can see this divergence. At least weekly use. The last 2 cohorts, significantly higher than cohort 1. It's a significant increasing linear trend, and it's the 21 to 25-year-olds that are really driving that. When we ask people, what does the typical person your age do? I mean, depending on the year, most people aren't using, but it's only about 2% of people that correctly get that right. We've even seen that over time, I mean, I look at 2019, you can see where it was the 20%. We literally had 1 in 5 young adults saying, I think the typical person my age uses cannabis daily. So what's noteworthy is that although only 21.6% used at least weekly, meaning most don't use weekly, over 2/3, 68.5%, thought the typical person their age, in fact, used at that frequency. When we ask where people are getting it, 18, 19, and 20-year-olds, we've seen a decreasing trend in getting it from friends and getting it from someone with a medical marijuana card, which makes sense as medical dispensaries in Washington were closed. Where we've seen an increase is giving money to someone to get it for them, getting it from parents with their permission. And during the pandemic, we saw for the first time anything other than a 0 stealing it from a store or dispensary. Among 21 to 25-year-olds, most sources have decreased. The one that has gone up, buying it from a retail store. And just one last little thing to look at, driving after cannabis use. When I-502 was written, Groten, Herman, and colleagues was cited as one of the studies that went behind our per se limit for driving under the influence. And Groten Herman's team had said it probably takes 3 hours to drop below Washington's per se limit of 5 nanograms of THC per milliliter of blood. So we asked people, in the past 30 days, how many times have you driven a car within 3 hours of using? In 2014, it was almost half of young adults that had used in the past 30 days who also said, I've driven within 3 hours of use. Fortunately, we're seeing a statistically significant decrease in that, though we do see this prevalence of driving within 3 hours of use still very high. Shout out to Dr. Brittany Holtgren, who with a grant she has from the Centers for Disease Control are looking at driving and riding with impaired drivers, whether that's for alcohol, cannabis, or both. So in looking at the potential practical considerations, I tried to pick 3. They're in no particular order, but especially as we get ready to start our academic year, I do think looking at academic outcomes and what that means in this age group, whether that's people in college or hoping to go to college. We just heard a presentation talking about cognitive effects, and I think the research we try and look at with this age group is research that looks at what happens when people stop using to their cognitive performance. Part of the brain that, among other things, affects attention, concentration, and memory is the hippocampus. After cannabis use, the neurons in this part of the brain get suppressed. They fire, but they fire at a rate that's lower and slower than it could or should be firing. In the 90s, Dr. Harrison Pope showed that a full 24 hours after cannabis use, there were decreases in these cognitive abilities. And the more frequently people used, the more pronounced these decreases were. Scientists said, well, that seems pretty noteworthy, but critics said, is it? It's not causal. What if people who struggle with attention are attracted to cannabis use? You don't know what comes first. Dr. Pope said, that's fair. Ethically, we can't take people who don't use and make them start, because that's unethical. But what if we have people that are using every day and have them quit and follow them over time? If their cognitive abilities stay the same, maybe they were there to start with. But if as they abstain, their cognitive abilities improve, that's causal. It takes 4 weeks, but 28 days after stopping daily cannabis use, you see no significant differences in these cognitive abilities compared to a control group of people who don't use at all. My former classmate, Susan Tapert, was senior author on a study in San Diego that looked at 15 to 19-year-olds who on average used every other day, showed that it took 2 weeks of abstinence for verbal learning to match that of a control group of who didn't use at all. Verbal working memory, 3 weeks of abstinence. Attention takes the full 4 weeks. Why is that so noteworthy? Numerous studies now, I can say numerous, have shown that the more frequently students use cannabis, the lower their grade point average tends to be, the more classes they skip. When followed over time, the less likely they are to still be enrolled, and the less likely they are to graduate on time. We're having very important conversations about how we make or keep college affordable for people. One of those is people getting out on time. And the research is showing that the more college students use cannabis, the less likely they are to graduate on time if they even make it to graduation. This afternoon, you're going to hear from Dr. Wayne Hall at the University of Queensland, who, when he did a webinar for our college coalition, said, if you could do one thing in Washington, this was April 2013, he said, I might screen in your counseling centers on college campuses for cannabis use disorder. He explained that when people meet criteria for cannabis use disorder, there's a pronounced three-way relationship between depression, suicide, and addiction. He recommended the Cannabis Use Disorder Identification Test Revised, the Q-R, which is a simple yes/no, have you used any cannabis over the past 6 months? If no, you're done. If yes, there's 8 items. These are also from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, and these, to me, are so striking. The bars on the left, people 18 and older in the United States with a past year cannabis use disorder. Yellow, no past year substance use disorder. We see a 6-fold increase in serious thoughts of suicide, a 7-fold increase in making a suicide plan, a 7-fold increase in attempting suicide. When we look at addiction risk and withdrawal, You know, I got to meet some of the speakers through this work group that we did in 2020, where WSU and University of Washington researchers looked at the research on high-potency cannabis, defined as anything over 10% THC. 97% of our retail market is high-potency cannabis. And the group from people that have not seen this, you can go to this link. You can download the consensus statement. There's a full 20-page report. There's a 2-page Cliff Notes version. Cliff was my favorite author when I was younger, so shout out to Cliff. And there's even slides that people can download. But we made very, very clear young people are particularly vulnerable, particularly for risk of cannabis use disorder or addiction. I worry how often I hear from students that they're using for things that they see as a good thing, but could actually be signs of withdrawal. Dr. Christine Lee, also in the audience, asked incoming first-year students, tell us why you use cannabis. And they said things like, I like the feeling, I like being high, gives me something to do with my friends, helps when I'm bored, makes things more fun, music sounds better, it's cool, it helps me celebrate. But they also said it helps me relax, helps me sleep, lets me cope when I'm depressed, relieves stress, helps when my appetite stinks, reduces anxiety, alleviates physical pain, helps when I have a headache. What are the criteria for cannabis withdrawal? Keeping this list in mind, it includes a lot of this list: anxiety, sleep problems, appetite problems, depressed mood, and headaches. So when we listen to students that are declining referrals for counseling, because they say, well, no, I know it helps my depression, because when I don't use, I get super depressed. When I use, that goes away. That can be managing withdrawal, and that can be managing a potential cannabis use disorder. I hear from some students with ADHD. They say, well, I get you on the research on attention and cannabis use, but I feel like it's got to help because when I don't use, I can't sit still. Look at number 5 of the withdrawal symptoms, restlessness. That can be withdrawal. If people are using that frequently, and when they don't use, they can't sit still, that can be withdrawal. I appreciated the statement that Bia made about medical use, and I'm not speaking to medical use. I want you to know that if students, again, are hearing, wait, it works for this, it works for this, it works for this, what if I just kind of take that on myself? An article that came out 6 months ago out of Massachusetts looked at people that asked for a medical marijuana card and got it versus those that were put in a 12-week wait list. Not surprisingly, the people that got the card immediately increased their use compared to the group in the control group. The point I want to make is, somewhat surprisingly to the researchers, what also increased is symptoms of cannabis use disorder in the group that got it immediately compared to people who were in that wait list. And what was striking is that in the study, there were no observed benefits, quoting verbatim, of obtaining a medical marijuana card for pain, anxiety, or depressive symptoms. What got better were people's self-report of insomnia. What got worse were cannabis use disorder symptoms. Again, we do so much on college campuses about mental health. And if people are declining consults or referrals and saying, I kind of want to take care of this myself by using what I heard can work, that's a very different thing than someone getting a medically supervised prescription or suggestion. That's something to be aware of. So in wrapping up, I do think the opportunity to screen is important. I have 2 minutes left. I hit my timer. Okay. Screen, she held up the 0 sign. I'm like, this doesn't lie. Cannabis, or that's my rating of how I'm doing. Thank you for the vote of confidence. Screen for cannabis use disorder. Brief motivational interviewing or motivational enhancement interventions show promise. I mentioned Dr. Lee earlier. Her iChamp program, Individual College Health for Alcohol and Marijuana program, shows significant reductions in time used, amount used, and even consequences endorsed. Consult about motives and reasons for use. Educate about withdrawal. We've done so much in our state for people under 21. Shout out to the Washington Healthy Youth Coalition, who's worked so hard for an organized prevention response. Given what we've found around those 21 to 25, look at potential of an added focus. And do be aware of guidelines for lower risk use, including instances where use might be outright contraindicated. Fisher and colleagues published an article in January talking about lower, not low, lower risk guidelines. They said the reason why we say lower is, if you look at the science, there is no universally safe level of cannabis use. If you want to avoid the harms, abstain. They say if people make the choice to use low potency where possible. They acknowledged that there was no categorically safe route, but that smoking was particularly risky. Keeping use occasional, a day or two a week, weekend only. On college campuses, we were amazed to see that they added this cognitive piece. If you notice the impacts to cognitive performance, stop. And not driving at least 6 to 8 hours after inhaling, 8 to 12 hours after use of edibles. They say that those with an active first-degree family history of psychosis, mood disorder, or substance use disorder should avoid or adjust their use as needed. And with that, with 15 seconds to go, there's me. My email address is jkilmer@uw.edu. Our Twitter @CSHRB_UW. I'll get out of the way and thank you for the chance to work with you today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kilmer. Our next speaker is Dr. Deborah Hasin, who is a professor of epidemiology at Columbia University and directs the Substance Dependence Research Group at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. Please welcome Dr. Hasin. Thank you.
So am I all set up to go here? Yes, looks like I am. Great.
Yeah.
Okay, back. Okay, great. Super. All right. Well, I would really like to thank Bea and also all the organizers of this conference for putting together a wonderful event. I must say I've really enjoyed all the talks so far. They've been so interesting. And I'm going to be presenting to you today on cannabis use and some issues with psychiatric comorbidity. I was originally asked to limit the talk to the effects of cannabis potency and the risk for psychosis, but it became clear in looking into that a broader topic was needed, and so that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to begin by talking about some measurement issues because they're really quite pertinent for the topic that I'll be presenting on. I think measurement issues in general for cannabis are salient unless you're in a lab where you really can control what people get. And that affects, in particular, behavioral outcomes and psychiatric outcomes, I would say. So unlike alcohol, where there's a general marketing policy, one knows how much alcohol is in beer and wine and hard liquor. There is such a thing as a standard drink, where you can really ask people about a standard drink and compute how much ethanol they're consuming. Not everybody in a survey will know what a standard drink is, but when you're conducting the survey, you can present them with enough information that they can give you more accurate answers about how much alcohol they're consuming. But as I think pretty much everybody in this audience knows, the picture's really very different for cannabis. Maybe in Washington State, people know more about what they're using and what the potency is and the quantities because of the way the market has evolved here in terms of how it's sold. But when you look across the country, there's wide differences by state. And when you look across time, especially looking at older studies, there are studies that ask about lifetime ever use, how often did they use, but that's about as far as they went in terms of quantifying use. How often did people use? And in addition to that, there have been studies that show that consumer knowledge of THC levels in the products that they use is pretty low. So all of this makes it a challenge to figure out the relationship between anything other than ever used or not and psychiatric outcomes. I'm going to talk just a bit about state laws and cannabis potency, and this dovetails with things that we heard earlier this morning. A couple of the things I present will dovetail with things that other people have presented. So I'm working now with Alan Budney, a colleague at Dartmouth, on developing a more accurate measure of cannabis consumption, including taking into account types of products used and potency. And in the course of doing that, we've been analyzing data on what people are using by the states that they live in and the cannabis legalization status of their state. So in a sample of approximately 4,000 people who were surveyed in an online survey in 2017, we divided the participants into those who lived in states that had legalized for recreational use, that's RCL, legalized for medical use, that's MCL only, and then no cannabis legalization. And in these older data, we found that there was significantly increased likelihood of using a highly potent concentrate cannabis product in participants in the recreational legalization states compared to all others. And then because there are important differences between the effects of medical cannabis laws and having no laws at all, we broke out the participants into the 3 groups, and we found there was an effect also in the recreational states, the medical states, and the no CL states. We basically redid the study using 2021 data. These data were collected last summer. Again, a sample of about 4,000 individuals. They had all used cannabis within the prior 7 days, which gave a nice, tight period for recall. Once again, we found that those participants living in states that had legalized for recreational purposes were more likely to use the potent cannabis concentrate products. And when we broke it out by the 3 groups, once again, those in recreationally legalized states, medically legalized states, both of those groups were more likely to use the potent cannabis concentrate products than those in the states with no laws. And that fits very well with what Dr. Calkins said earlier about the effects of legalization. So I'm going to go on now to talk about the relationship of cannabis use to other mental disorders and conditions. And by other here, I mean disorders other than psychosis. And I think that these findings can be summarized very nicely by looking at the results of a meta-analysis of 26 different studies that were conducted where adolescent cannabis use was examined as a predictor of the risk of depression or anxiety disorders in young adulthood. On the top part of this table, you see depression. On the bottom part, you see anxiety. And in the figure on the right, everything that's to the right of the vertical line with the 1 indicates an increased risk amongst those that used cannabis for the disorders. And what you see here is a statistically significant increased risk across all of these studies for depressive disorders. You don't see a statistically significant increase in the risk for anxiety disorders. This review also considered suicidal outcomes, and as we heard in the previous talk, there were effects here too. So the top part of the table here shows suicidal ideation. The bottom part shows suicide attempts. Here, there was a greater risk amongst those who had used cannabis for suicidal ideation and for suicide attempts. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to cannabis use and psychosis, and first I'm going to talk about that relationship regardless of potency. So this is from another meta-analysis. There's been a lot of interest in these topics and a lot of studies published, so at this point, meta-analyses are really how one needs to look to see aggregated results and what they add up to. So here you see, going from left to right across the bottom axis, the intensity of cannabis exposure, which is largely frequency. And on the right, you see the increased risk for having a psychotic disorder or some type of psychosis outcome. And as you can see across all of these studies, with varying levels of strength of the relationship, as cannabis intensity exposure increases, so does the risk for this psychotic disorder. And here we see another one of these forest plots. On top, we see psychotic symptoms. On the bottom, we see diagnoses of psychosis. Here, the vertical line of 1, which indicates no increased risk, is sort of to the left, and what we have is a vertical line at 4, which is a pretty strong relationship. And we see that for all of these outcomes, psychotic symptoms, diagnosis of psychosis, and aggregated across all the studies, there's quite a substantial effect for the use of cannabis and the risk for these psychosis outcomes. What about among patients that already have a diagnosis of psychosis? If they continue to use cannabis, what's their prognosis? What's their risk for relapse? So this is another meta-analysis that was conducted and published about 5-6 years ago. And once again, it's a large number of studies. And we see that there was an increased risk for poor outcome among the patients that continued to use cannabis. Now, most of the studies that I've just presented to you in these meta-analyses were what's known as case control studies. So you have a group of cases who may be patients with a particular condition, in this case a psychiatric disorder or psychosis. And you have controls who are matched more or less well for demographics, but they are clear of the psychiatric condition under consideration. Most of these are local studies. They're fairly small studies. But in my group, we were interested in seeing what would happen if we looked at the relationship between cannabis use at various levels and self-reported psychotic disorders. And we were able to do that by making use of two large national surveys that were conducted about 10 years apart that used the same assessment instrument, so it was possible to compare their results. And Ophir Livni, who's a postdoc in my group, took the lead on this paper. So what we found, first of all, was that the outcome here was psychotic disorders reported by the participants, but it was only considered positive if the psychotic disorder had been diagnosed by a doctor or another medical professional. We saw a statistically significant increase in psychosis between the two studies. And here's what we got when we looked at the relationship between the self-reported psychotic disorders by participants' level of past year cannabis use. This is for the total sample, the number we just looked at a minute ago, and this is aggregated by use. So those with no cannabis use in the last 12 months, this is in the more recent survey, had less prevalence, and then you see as the level of cannabis intensity increased, there was an increasing risk for the self-reported psychotic disorders. That's in the survey that was conducted in 2012-2013. And here's the same set of results translated into odds ratios, which shows that any cannabis use increased the risk for self-reported psychosis by a factor of almost 3. Once you got up to the level of cannabis use disorder, either by DSM-4 or DSM-5, the risk was increased by about 5-fold. We also were interested in whether the relationship was consistent across time. So here on the left, you see the older survey. On the right, you see the more recent survey. The blue bars are those that had used cannabis. The green bars are those that didn't. You can see that there's quite a pronounced difference in the prevalence of self-reported psychotic disorder, and that relationship was found in both of these surveys. This is the same type of figure, but it's examining daily or near daily cannabis use versus no use. Once again, we see the sharp difference consistently across studies. And here's the relationship for a cannabis use disorder compared to people that didn't use cannabis at all. Again, a sharp difference. Another way of examining this was conducted by researchers in Denmark. So Denmark has the advantage of a psychiatric register where everyone that's treated in a medical setting, any type of medical setting, gets added to the register, so it's possible to track psychiatric disorders over time. So over a period when cannabis use increased in Denmark, these researchers looked at what happened to rates of cannabis-induced psychosis using the registry data, and they found that it did increase. And they also looked at the relationship across time of schizophrenia, and they found that that increased too. So I'm going to finally turn now to the topic that I was originally asked to speak about, which is cannabis potency and the risk of psychosis. And I'm going to start that by talking about a study that was conducted in London, actually, which began a number of years ago. Why in London? Well, in London, there were different types of cannabis used, including one kind called skunk, which was known as being a higher potency type of cannabis. There were a bunch of other kinds of cannabis that people could use too. If you look at how skunk was defined, which is up here on the slide, by today's standards, that's not particularly high potency at all. And the low potency cannabis that people had available, you probably would even have trouble finding it. And the way this study was set up, it was a case control study. The cases were psychotic patients who were after they'd had a first episode, so it was incidents of psychosis, and then they had a fairly carefully matched set of community controls. The sample size was about 450. If you look at the top row there, you see that the prevalence of any lifetime cannabis use was pretty similar in the psychotic patients and in the control group. suggesting that there was no particular risk from any lifetime cannabis use. But amongst the users, those who had used skunk were much more prevalent in the group of psychotic patients than they were in the community controls, suggesting that there was risk that was conferred by using skunk, the more highly potent form. The researchers went on to expand the study by adding another more than 300 additional participants, and we can see some similar results here. Not much effect for any use of lifetime cannabis, but there was a big difference in the likelihood of using skunk between the psychotic patients and the community controls, indicating some risk from skunk. And using skunk every day really had the largest increase in odds using these numbers from the calculations done with the psychotic patients and the community controls. Well, the researchers were interested in expanding this, as well as a number of other questions that were addressed in the London study. They wanted to see if it would replicate. They wanted to see if it would, how it would look when considered across different types of settings. So across Europe, it was still possible to differentiate between cannabis that was stronger, which was called skunk, or other local names in the language of the country that the study was done, and the lower forms of potency. And once again, we're talking about high potency here with quote marks around it, because by today's standards, that wouldn't necessarily be considered high potency at all. What we see here in terms of the preliminary results are just different. There's some differences between the psychotic patients and the community controls and their likelihood of using cannabis at all. But once again, we see a pretty pronounced difference for using the high potency form between the case groups of the psychotic patients and the community controls. And then this is a slide that summarizes a lot of results from the larger study across Europe that included also a site from Brazil. And basically what this figure boils down to is that the more often the cannabis was used and the more often the highly potent form was used, the greater was the risk for having a psychotic disorder. So those who were using the higher, more highly potent form of THC daily were at the greatest risk compared to the other groups. There was some discussion of all of these relationships by geneticists who posed the possibility that maybe there was a common genetic variant that gave rise both to cannabis use and to psychosis. This led to a lot of discussion and a lot of studies. At this point, those discussions have been largely resolved as with an acknowledgement that psychosis is a complex condition. There are a lot of genetic and environmental factors, but it seems clear that cannabis use is one of those environmental factors that needs to be considered. So to summarize, it's safe to say, it's entirely safe to say, that cannabis use is highly associated with increased risk for psychotic disorders and increased risk for relapse amongst those that are diagnosed with it in the first place. Most research on the effects of cannabis potency was conducted during years when high-potency cannabis was pretty weak by today's standards. From a health and prevention standpoint, it's reasonable to conclude that today's very high-potency cannabis products might confer even greater risk for psychosis. It's important to remember that although psychotic disorders are fairly rare in the general population, they are very debilitating disorders and very burdensome to patients and their families and to society as a whole as well. So that's one public health reason among many to limit, one could say, marketing of very high potency cannabis products in ways that can be done effectively. And also to consider that now that cannabis use is widely seen as harmless by the general population, some education for clinicians and for the general public appears warranted. And doing this review of these studies made me think about the fact that it would really be of some interest to try to reduce some of this research in today's settings where people would be able to say more about what they were using, how often they were using, and what the potency was. It would be a challenging study to do, especially with large enough sample size to be able to really detect differences. But that would be the way to really see what's going on with these relationships in today's, as people seem fond of saying, cannabis landscape. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hasin. Our final panelist, and then we'll have lots of time for Q&A, I hope, is Dr. Rosalie Pacula, who is the Chair of Health Policy, Economics, and Law at the Sol Price School of Public Policy at USC. Please welcome Dr. Pacula. Thank you.
I'm missing out on a good time with a lot of my good friends and colleagues there who have been doing a lot of research that I will be summarizing a bit for you. Looks like I need to have a slide ahead there. Before coming to the University of Southern California, I had spent 21 years at the RAND Corporation, 15 years co-directing RAND's Drug Policy Research Center, doing work with Jonathan Calkins, Bo Kilmer, and was part of the Mark Klein team there in Washington State. So I'm very appreciative of this opportunity to come back and talk to you about what I was asked to talk about was some recommendations for regulating a high potency cannabis. And it's hard not to talk about topic without hitting on some of the topics that John already mentioned. So for those of you who might be joining late, here's a quick recap. No surprise, there's a lot of overlap given our work together. Next slide, please. So the main reason why if you look at, I'm going to take a step back from Washington and look at the U.S. in general, and then some international comparisons. But as John mentioned in his keynote address earlier, we have seen large increases in average potency of cannabis plants, large declines in purity adjusted price, and rapid proliferation of cannabis products. Next slide, please. What I'm reiterating here very quickly is this. In this slide, an increase in the red line in average potency of cannabis seized by law enforcement. So this is not cannabis sold in legal stores, but in law enforcement over the last couple decades. And there's been more than a threefold increase in the average rate of THC of cannabis picked up in the black market. Next slide. This is still well below what's available in the legal markets. As Julia Dilley was explaining there for Washington State, average potency of flower materials in Washington, if you look at the high potency products in data up just through 2018, this data from Stephen Davenport, who did it under his dissertation under John, looking in Washington State, average potency was around 20% per flower material for strictly high potency cannabis plant, but those that were equal CBD THC still had potencies around 10% THC. Please, next slide. However, when you look at concentrates and vaping oils, even back in data well before our current time period and before COVID, we were seeing concentration rates. These are box and whisker plots. So the line in the middle of the colored red is showing you the median level of potency for different cannabis products on the bottom. And for many of the concentrates and vapings, the median potency is well above 70%. Next slide. And if you look at those that are equal products of THC and CBD, even here, what are considered to be more moderate products because of the high levels of CBD still have potency of THC around 40% in the concentrates. Next slide. Because I'm not as good at doing math in my head as John is, I'm showing you here a slide. This is from Colorado, and the potency adjusted average price of various products, both first in the recreational market is the solid lines, and in the medical market is the same color in dotted lines. And what it's basically showing you is a significant decline in the potency adjusted average price for cannabis in Colorado, such that by 2018 was well below $2 per dose of THC. Next slide. That was Colorado. Here's data from Stephen Davenport for Washington State, and it shows us that prices of the various products in Washington State, when we adjust for potency through 2018, are actually even lower than that for what we observed in Colorado. Next slide. Go ahead and click a few more times, 4 times, we'll get to, and one more time, there we go. The proliferation of products, just go back one. The proliferation of products in cannabis has generated quite a variety of innovative new ideas. And while this would be great if this was appealing to myself or my parents who are 50 years and older, there's a lot of products that are also clearly targeting a younger group, and it's not surprising that these innovations are generating things that, while on the letter of the law, are illegal in states like Washington and still being seen in the marketplace. Next slide. So, is the current regulatory scheme working? And I think it depends on what metrics you're using for success as to whether or not you think it is or isn't. There are enormous reductions in criminal justice costs associated with legalization. We are seeing a reduction in the number of arrests. Unfortunately, we aren't seeing the decline in the differential of racial disparities in arrests that we expected to see with legalization. Surprise, legalization didn't get rid of our problems of racial disparity of law enforcement, but it has led to reduction in overall arrests and a reduction in the costs of those arrests. We've seen new jobs. We have a great new source of tax revenue, and there's based off the early signs of Washington state data, not the more recent data that Jason Kilmer was just presenting, there were signs that was relatively mild impacts on youth, which was promising at first. Next click. But there are some aspects of our regulation that aren't really working. And I want to point out that without caps on potency and without huge taxes based off of potency, we already still are dealing with an illicit market for cannabis. And that's not surprising because that illicit market existed before we legalized. And when we legalized, even Washington state, and I say we, I mean the states, it wasn't with the level of enforcement and supervision as when we legalized alcohol post-prohibition, where there was a very concerted effort to make sure that what we did when we stepped forward was within a very narrow range of behaviors. And then we had the federal government that was supporting that effort behind it. States are doing it alone here. The industry claims that the only way to stop the illicit market is to take away all the restrictions, don't allow for potency caps, don't allow for product restrictions. We need to remove taxes in California. That's the claim. We need to remove taxes because it's going to be the only way that we can compete with the illicit market. It's also the only way that the state is getting revenue to do its compliance checks and to make sure that the players who are operating are doing so fairly. In California, this is not the case in Washington state, but we have at least as many illicit shops in LA as we do as legal shops. And that's because we don't have good enforcement to shut down the illicit shops. So if you don't have revenue to do compliance from taxes and license fees just aren't enough, then you're not going to have a well operating legal market that protects the legal entrants. The industry is going to be made worse off if government does not have revenues to make sure it can enforce and force others to comply with the state regulations. There's also growing evidence of health risks that have been mentioned already by many of the speakers before me, but let me highlight a few more that I think are particularly relevant. Next slide. We'll skip to that point. I'll come back to it later. Next click. I'm going to be pointing to these health risks as they tie to particular recommendations that we offered in a recent white paper at USC Schaefer that got released. And the first is to seriously consider caps on the amount of THC in cannabis products. And I know that there's a risk of doing this for fear of the black market, but let me give you some convincing and compelling evidence as to why it might still work. Next slide. If you look at outside of the U.S., let's start with what's happening in legalization in other countries. In Uruguay, they've had a very strict cap on flower sold in their pharmacies, and it's at a THC. Only flower can be sold, and it has only a 9% THC. They do allow other goods to be used in their social clubs, but they are not legally sold. The participation of individuals, they have to choose if they're going to obtain their cannabis from pharmacies or from social clubs, and pharmacies are still a viable source for some of the individuals who are using cannabis in Uruguay. Edibles, concentrates are prohibited, like I said, oils, but they are still being generated within social clubs, and membership in social clubs has been relatively high, but it's not being sold and marketed. The social clubs are not marketing these goods. to other consumers. In Canada, initially when they legalized, as many of you know, legalized in October 2018 with only flower material being allowed to be sold. It wasn't until January 2020 that edibles and other extracts and goods could be sold in the Canadian marketplace, and states and the provinces in Canada were allowed to make their own decisions with that regard. There were restrictions on the amount of THC that could be sold across the different types of product goods, with the exception of flower. Flower was the only one that wasn't limited. Edibles, it's not just that there were reductions in the amount of THC that could be sold. It was in a whole package. You know, in Washington State, one serving is a 10 milligram serving, and a package has 100 milligrams. In Canada, one package cannot have more than 10 milligrams of an edible. Extracts, only up to a gram of THC per unit, and other oils, it's around 1 milligram of THC. There's no similar restrictions to Canada or Uruguay in the US, and Washington's are actually pretty good. In Washington, like I said, there's the restriction on edibles, but Vermont and Connecticut are really the most forward-thinking states right now, and thinking about caps for potency of different products, placing potency on flower material around 30% THC and on solid concentrates of 60% THC. Now, this is a lot higher than what was being considered in Washington real recently, and is more consistent with some of the products that were being sold in its medical market, which is why those rates were being used. They weren't coming from nowhere. Next slide. How valuable and important are these caps? Let me give you an example from Canada. What I'm showing you here is a figure that was produced by Daniel Myron and his colleagues at University of Ottawa and Ottawa Hospital Research Institute, where they compared rates of youth poisoning, so this is pediatric poisonings, and ED visits in Quebec, which is the solid blue line, as compared to Alberta and British. Yeah, I can't read my own sign. British Columbia, and sorry, it's a little small on mine. I know Ottawa's not in there, and I'm showing you here what happened in the trends in poisonings observed in Canada prior to the introduction of all edibles, oils, and extracts in January of 2020. So before this, and with just simple legalization in all three provinces, there was a small increasing trend in youth-related poisonings. Then with the national allowance for edibles and concentrates, Quebec was the only province that didn't allow edibles and concentrates to be sold in addition to flower. The only other good they allowed was liquids, drinks. And what you see is a huge divergence between Quebec and British Columbia and Alberta with the allowance of this new products, because with these oils and concentrates, which are wrapped in smaller doses, being sold in smaller doses, as I mentioned in the previous slide, there's still a substantial increase in the number of youth poisonings just because the products exist. Now, it's important to think about this slide. Quebec is a relatively it's not the most populous. Ottawa is the most populous, and it's very close by. It's very easy for people to take products from Ottawa into Quebec if they're driving. As John was mentioning earlier, there is a way for a black market to emerge. And yet the fact that it's not being sold in the cells and in the stores in Quebec, we do not see the huge increase in poisonings for youth that we do in the other provinces. Now, I wanted to show you another figure where we looked beyond youth and looked at adults, cannabis hypermesia syndrome. Nope, not next slide, go back. I couldn't show you a slide because the study was not yet publicly released. It just got dropped today in JAMA Network Open, where Daniel, Myron, and myself and the same group of colleagues were looking at cannabis hypermesia syndrome, not just in hospitalizations, but we could account for cannabis visits 6 months prior and 6 months post the ED visit. because in Canada you have linked healthcare data, which is a really nice feature compared to the US. So we're not just talking about ED visits. We can identify cannabis use in other outpatient visits because they aren't generally recorded in the ED visit, even in Canada. And what we found, we were looking in Ontario, excuse me. We were looking on Ontario in Canada and did interrupted time series look at what happened to cannabis hypermesis in just medicalization, then legalization of flower, and then post the introduction of new products. Now, why Ontario was not included in this graph and why I'm only telling you the story of Ontario is that Ontario had an additional little boost that didn't exist for the other provinces. Ontario through March of 2020 had a cap on the number of licenses allowed to be, for retail sale of only 62. In the most populous province in Canada, only 62 retail outlets were allowed to be selling cannabis. That cap got dropped starting April of 2020. And there was a 13-fold increase in the number of retail outlets, going from 62 to 862 outlets in just 14 months. At the same time that you have an increase in the potency products that are allowed to be sold in the retail market because of concentrates and edibles being allowed in Ontario. And what we found for adult cannabis hypermesis syndrome was a 50 to 60% increase in Ontario associated with both these policy changes. If you want more details of that, I encourage you to download our article that's now publicly available as of today. Next slide. So the biggest argument that I have heard about why we shouldn't cap potency of products, the industry is not then going to be responsive to medical patients. So what I'm showing you here is some results from analysis that I did with a postdoc graduate student, Alexandra Kritikos, who used Columbia Care data. Columbia Care is one of only 5 medical businesses allowed to operate in the state of New York. And this is showing you products sold by their retail outlets. They had at the time anywhere between 5 and 7 outlets within the state of New York, where they were required to track patients' purchases over time to meet compliance with state laws. So in these states, the patient, when they purchased, it got added to the state PDMP. It had to be reported to the state PDMP. And so we know over time how much the same individual is buying if they're buying from this dispensary, because we have the dispensary level data. And what we did was look at what are the products that people are buying and what's the maximum formulation that's being sold by type of product in these medical dispensaries. And that's what I'm showing you here in this table. What's important to see is that high potency THC products that are being used in the medical market in New York State, a state during this time period that did not allow flower. So you don't see flower here. You see tinctures, you see vaporizers, you see tablets. There were no restrictions placed on the maximum THC allowable in the product. And yet the medical grade products being used by patients had a maximum THC dose of 10 milligrams per dose, even in the high THC products. And the overall amount of THC in the product was 150 milligrams for a tablet, 180 milligrams for a vaporizer. These are much smaller quantities of THC than what we are observing in the recreational market in Washington state. And there are not patients screaming in New York that they can't get the level of potency they want. They are screaming that there aren't enough dispensaries available. And now you have legalization in New York state as well. Next slide. So a second recommendation that I would have is limit the types of products that can have cannabis infused with them. This is not because I think we should restrict what is available to medical patients. I think on a medical market, it should be free game. Whatever the patient needs to use to deal with their condition in a way that is seen by their physician is appropriate, and the industry can tailor products to that. But on the recreational market, to the extent that we have THC-infused Twinkies, THC infused Reese's peanut butter cups, and they aren't being sold as Reese's peanut butter cups, but it looks just like them with a slightly different label. Those sort of products are targeting to an audience that are likely to be first and naive users and get exposed to way too much THC in a single use. We can reduce the harm to naive users as well as risk of potential addiction if we limit the types of products, meaning products that are already publicly available can't just be infused. You need to have unique cannabis products, and please don't mix it with alcohol. We have those laws in place, and yet we have, as I showed you on a previous slide, CBD wine available. And who's regulating to make sure and testing those products to make sure there's no THC in those products? Right now, the agencies don't have the resources to do that. So we need to be more careful. Until we have the resources to properly regulate all products and know what's in them, we should limit the products so that we know what's being delivered in the legal market is indeed what's reported on the label and is safe for the consumer. Next slide. We should consider instituting potency-based sales limits. Now, this is another one of those that has gotten a little bit of pushback, but let me give you, again, a little bit of comparison for where this is coming from. Next slide. If you look in the United States, and this is work that I did with my colleagues at Boston University, what we did was we looked across states at the rules regarding sales limits for a single purchase of cannabis when you go into a retail outlet. And we, based off of the types of products that can be purchased, there's usually a weight-based limit for flower between 1 and 2.5 ounces. On edibles, there's anywhere between 10 blanking on up to 5 grams, and then the similar for concentrates and extracts. These are in the legal statutes. We then applied the average potency, and again, box and whisker plots. The bottom left of this box and whisker plot is the lowest potency available product of that type. So lowest flower potency, lowest extract potency for that state. The 25th percentile, the median, the 70th percentile, that makes up the big blue box. And then the right tail is the highest potency available in Washington state. So we used what we could see in Washington seed to sale data from Steve Davenport's work on the range of potencies for different products. And we applied that average potency to the limits that were being set in all the other states and came up with the number of 10 milligram THC doses that's allowed legally by law. There's not a single state that allows fewer than 500 10 milligram doses to be sold at medium potency across the U.S. and Washington state in particular for the average potency products on the market in 2018, a typical purchase in a single transaction be 1,000 10 milligram doses. Let me put that again in perspective. Click, please. A keg of beer has 165 standard beer 12-ounce servings. A keg of beer. And you have to go to special stores usually to get a keg. So when we think about cannabis and how much cannabis we're allowing to be sold in a single transaction, weight-based metrics are not indicative of the level of potency that could be consumed in that transaction. And it's highly possible to have diversion from the legal market when we're allowing such large quantities to be purchased of THC through legal channels. Next slide. Again, if we compare this to what's happening in other countries, there's Uruguay, which had 40 grams cap per month that you can buy in pharmacies. Now that's highly restrictive and wouldn't be acceptable in most US states. But even in Canada, the restrictions are 30 grams of dried cannabis or the equivalent in a single purchase. 30 grams of flower, maybe 40% THC. These are still substantially lower than in Washington state where you're residing, where a person could buy an ounce of flower, so a little bit less than a gram, and they could buy 7 grams of a concentrate, and they can buy 16 ounces of edibles, and they can buy 72 fluid ounces of liquid, all in one purchase. This is where we get those 1,000 doses of 10 milligram THC in a single purchase, because the individual, based off weight, this doesn't sound like much cannabis at all. But when you translate it into THC potency, it's large amounts that are being sold in a single transaction. Next slide. So the fourth recommendation I have, and final recommendation, is to please continue dedicating serious resources towards regulation and enforcement of the regulations that get put in place. And to do this, you need to maintain taxes at a level that can support the compliance checks, that can support the testing, that can support the checking of products and safety wrapping and messaging. Reductions in taxes, or taxes that are tied strictly to prices when prices are falling, are not going to be sufficient to maintain the level of checks and compliance necessary to have a safely operating industry. And you can do a better job checking the black market if you have the resources to check streets to find out if the stores that are open are indeed legal or not. So again, it's important to give money to prevention. It's important to give money and provide opportunities to communities that have been hurt by prohibition, but it's also important to maintain the system, the rules of play, so that everybody is playing by the same rules. And that can only be done with revenue from taxes. Potency-based tax revenue is difficult to implement, but will generate more consistent level revenue as prices continue to fall for you to sustain the regulatory regime that's needed. And with that, I will go ahead and open it up to the panel and for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our presenters today and to Representative Davis as well. This has been a very insightful conference, and we are running a little bit over, but we have a lunch break scheduled, so if possible, I'd like to have the panelists come forward, please, because we are miking and videotaping, and we'll try to get through as many questions as we can. These questions have several different common themes. One, of course, is just kind of the general policy recommendations that were made and the implications. There are also some specific questions about the research. So if we don't get to those in time, please do email the researchers directly. I'm sure they'd be happy to answer those for you. But I do want to take advantage of the group wisdom, so I'm going to ask just first a general question, which is, given the conversation that we've had and the restrictions that the retailers have about selling to youth, we also heard some information about perhaps theft of products as being one venue of access for youth. How do you suggest that we address the problems of youth access?
Is this on? No.
Yep, it's on.
I will say briefly, I think parents have to be partners in prevention. In fact, one of the sources for 18, 19, 20-year-olds who were growing up was parents with their permission. I sometimes fear, and I hear from parents, the chance that they're operating off of an old script. If a parent says, I used when I was younger, I turned out fine, they use different stuff. And so making sure parents are aware of how truly influential they are, they're aware of the impacts on mental health, academic outcomes, that's one piece of the puzzle.
Thank you. And I just want to comment also, because I'm a clinician, that, and I did see this in some of the presentations, that there's a lack of understanding on the part of clinicians. And you talked about doing some outreach to clinicians as well. If you're a healthcare provider for that child or for that family, if the healthcare provider themselves is just sort of, poo-pooing cannabis use, that's not going to be a helpful communication. Dr. Kilmer, I'm going to pick on you a little bit more because I think this is related.
No further questions.
This is related to what we just talked about. You indicated that the data that you presented for 2020 and 2021 showed a theft from dispensaries or stores as a means of obtaining cannabis products, and that increased from 0 to low levels. And the question is if that survey distinguishes between cannabis products obtained from regulated retail stores versus hemp-derived intoxicating products from, gas stations and other places.
Yeah, no, we ask about retail stores, so that is different. And it was, in part that was significant largely because it had been 0 every other time point. The good news, it is low prevalence, it is more significant. We did distinctly ask about retail stores.
Thank you. I think another question that we have quite a few questions about potency, and for Dr. Cuttler, I think one question that's kind of interesting is, well, high potency consumers seem to self-titrate. Were you able to estimate the actual THC dose by the puff, inhale, hold times in any way?
No, and we didn't try to do that either because it's a really hard thing to capture in such a naturalistic setting over Zoom like that. We unfortunately were not able to do that. No.
And just a related follow-up question, how much do you think your findings on acute memory effects were due to compensatory behaviors in consumption of different forms of cannabis, given that you found people achieved a similar high whether using flower or concentrates?
Can you say that again?
Sure. How much do you think your findings on acute memory effects were due to compensatory behavior in consumption of the different forms of cannabis?
Yeah, I think that explains it. I think that the fact that they used a lower dose of the higher potency product explains why they have equivalent levels of intoxication and impairment. I think if I had forced them to use the same number of puffs of concentrate as flower, we would have seen a big difference in performance. They might have fallen out of their chair. I'm not sure what would have happened there. But yes. But that was very important for our study that we did that. It was done for legal reasons. I couldn't control the smoking session. I couldn't tell people how much to use without getting myself into legal trouble, according to our Attorney General. And so it was necessary, but I'm glad that we did it because it led to this kind of serendipitous finding that they're just self-titrating using a lot less.
Thank you. And we've talked a lot about the potential of legislating THC caps or bans today. With the release and the use of high-potency products, do the panelists feel that a strong enough consumer market has developed that will limit the viability of legislating these caps or bans? Anybody can take that.
No, I think that we're seeing a rise in the purchases of these products, but John showed very clearly who's buying them. It's repeated consumers that are already heavy users, and that's from a public health perspective, the group that we would want to slow down. What we want to do is prevent a larger population normalization of this level of THC. If people are enjoying small doses, and that it's what you're used to relaxing with. If you're used to relaxing with wine, you don't need to be taking vodka shots. And that's what we're trying to set as a normalization. And I don't think when the voters voted to legalize, they were voting to legalize the most potent forms of the cannabis. They were voting based off their prior experiences. And so we should set up a market that is promoting that environment that they voted for.
Anybody? Okay. A couple different things around concerns, again, about youth and mental health and suicidality. I think the one question I'd like to draw to your attention is there any research suggesting that the risk of suicidal thoughts among cannabis consumers is higher among 21 to 25-year-olds?
I think that's an important research question. I've not seen anything with the focus solely on that older part of the young adult age group.
Thank you. And let's see, we have quite a few about concentrates and policy recommendations. Most of the cannabis research has been focused on THC concentration. Has there been any significant studies on how different cannabis strains affect different cognitive effects and lineages? Cultivars, yes.
So that was part of what I was trying to get at anyway. There's no difference between indica and sativa if this is where that's going. You know, we now know that everything is a hybrid nowadays. That's common folklore propagated by bud tenders. So we just wanted to look at the different constituents or levels of THC versus CBD anyway in that study. I would really like to do research on some of the minor phytocannabinoids. We're doing a study right now looking at the effects of cannabidiol because we do think that some of these are going to produce different effects, and terpene profiles might have different effects as well. I don't know that we're going to see much of this on cognition specifically, though. I think it really is the THC that is implicated in the cognitively impairing effects of cannabis.
Thank you. We have a question as to whether anybody is looking at Google Analytics to identify youth exposure, specific exposure signals.
Not to my knowledge.
Dr. Dilley?
I'm blanking on details, but Oregon's Student Health Survey has included questions about where kids have seen advertising, and we published some findings from that, focused more on community-based. We were especially interested in documenting storefront advertising or billboard advertising because those are easily regulated, whereas but online advertising was very high, is my recollection, but it's so difficult to regulate.
Megan Moreno, I hope I'm remembering this right. Megan Moreno's done some work taking a look at exposure not only to ad on social media. No further questions.
That the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria for cannabis use disorder has to do with increased, according to the questioner, THC tolerance and dependence. And is there any inclination or intuition that the use of high-potency products indicates higher THC tolerance and may predict some level of dependency?
I think that's a fascinating question to see what direction that goes, but tolerance is one of the criteria for a substance use disorder. So if someone says, I'm increasingly needing more to feel what I feel, that is one of the criteria associated with that.
Good point. Yes.
There are some studies that have shown that greater potency leads to greater likelihood of cannabis use disorder symptoms. And I think it's worth noting that tolerance has long been a criteria for cannabis use disorder. It was a criteria for cannabis dependence in the DSM-4 and earlier, and it was only with the publication of DSM-5 that cannabis withdrawal was included, which, as we know now, is a really important element, and craving was included as well.
Can I just say, I agree. I think that higher potency versions of the drug are more likely to increase risk of CUD. I absolutely won't argue against that statement, but I also think that people with CUD are more likely to use higher potency versions of the drug because they developed a tolerance. So now they're seeking a much more high potency form. So any sort of cross-sectional survey looking at this and linking the two is problematic because there's a huge chicken and egg problem there. It's probably a bi-directional relationship.
And I think I have time for at least one more question along the regulatory vein. Several people on the panel have mentioned issues with youth appealing products, particularly for edibles. How do we create legislation for banning youth appealing products given how subjective the criteria seems to be?
Remove all color.
And we also, our Zoomer is raising her hand. Yes, go ahead, Dr. Pacula.
I was just going to say, this is not rocket science. We've dealt with this before with cigarettes and with vaping. It's a very similar problem. And vaping, in terms of appealing to youth, flavors, in terms of candies, it's pretty obvious. If you're making something a Pop-Tart, there's not many adults, yes, a few of us, my husband included, will eat Pop-Tarts when allowed, but that's appealing to a younger age group. And so I think that this is something that good common sense and regular review could easily set up. I don't think it is, if the industry was required to first provide a new product development idea the way they are to the FDA, then that will help provide us the opportunity to say yes or no before they go into mass production. And it's not something that's hard to do. We just chose to do it because of not having federal participation in the market.
I think we need THC-infused vegetables.
Thank you very much. And on that, I believe that we will have a break for a healthy lunch. Thank you very much, everyone.